My family betrayed me while I was away. The shocking truth about what they did to my home left me stunned, and I never imagined life would turn out this way, but here I am, penning this account of how everything unraveled. It began in the most mundane way possible, sitting in the small but cozy living room of the house I shared with my mom and dad. The sunlight streaming through the window illuminated the familiar family photos on the mantel, a gallery of smiles that no longer felt genuine. My parents sat across from me, exchanging nervous glances before Dad finally spoke. "Hannah, your mom and I have decided to separate." His voice was calm, too calm for the gravity of the moment. I stared at them, unsure how to react. Divorce wasn't entirely unexpected. After all, they had been living like polite strangers for years. There were no fights, no yelling, just two people drifting in opposite directions under one roof. Family dinners had dwindled to an occasional occurrence, often silent and filled with the clinking of utensils rather than conversation. Somehow, I had seen this coming. They assured me it was amicable, that they still cared for each other but wanted different things. I nodded, my heart sinking a little, but I didn't cry. At 27, I thought I was too old to be blindsided by their divorce. I had been saving up to move out, working a steady office job, and making my plans for the future. I told myself I could handle this. Dad moved into a modest apartment in Greenville, about an hour away from our home in Cedarville. We kept up our routine of pizza and sci-fi movie nights every other weekend. It felt strange but manageable. Mom, meanwhile, seemed to throw herself into finding a new sense of purpose. She joined local gardening clubs, started going to community events, and even hinted at dating. I tried to be happy for her. Then she met Alan Sinclair. Alan was charming, too charming, I'd later realize. He was a 56-year-old widower, well-dressed and always ready with a warm smile. Mom came home one morning practically floating with excitement. I was still groggy from a late-night work deadline when she burst into the kitchen, her voice bubbling with enthusiasm. "Hannah, I've met someone," she announced, setting down her grocery bags with a flourish. "His name is Alan, and he's wonderful. He has a daughter, Jessica. She's in college. Wouldn't it be nice to have a sister?" I blinked, trying to process the rapid shift in her demeanor. It had been barely a year since the divorce, and suddenly Mom was talking about blending families as though it were a recipe she just discovered. "Sure, Mom," I replied cautiously, not wanting to dampen her excitement, but something in her eagerness unsettled me. The courtship was quick, too quick for my comfort. Within a few months, Alan and Jessica were regular fixtures in our home. Jessica was 20, a college student who seemed perfect at first glance. She had polished manners, wore expensive clothes, and always said the right things in front of adults. But when the grown-ups weren't around, she was someone else entirely. Little things began to chip away at the illusion of harmony. My laundry would mysteriously go missing, only to reappear ruined with bleach spots or ink stains. Coffee rings appeared on my work documents, ones I had carefully placed out of harm's way. My favorite mug, one I'd had since college, was accidentally dropped and shattered. Jessica always had a plausible excuse, a saccharine smile, and a way of making me feel ridiculous for questioning her. Then there was Alan. He had a knack for disguising criticism as advice. "Don't you think that skirt's a bit short for the office?" he'd ask with a paternal tone. Or, "Maybe if you spent less time on your phone and more time networking, you'd have a better position by now." It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, a thinly veiled judgment that chipped away at my confidence. I tried to talk to Mom about it, but she dismissed my concerns with infuriating ease. "Alan's just being protective," she'd say. "He wants the best for you. And Jessica? She's adjusting. It's not easy for her, you know. But what about me?" I wanted to scream. Where was my adjustment period in all of this? Things came to a head one evening when I arrived home early from work. I had spent weeks preparing for a critical presentation, poring over every detail to make it perfect. My materials were neatly organized on my desk, or so I thought. As I stepped into my room, I froze. Jessica was standing there, marker in hand, scribbling over my charts and notes. The work I had stayed late for, sacrificed sleep for, was now a mess of ink and smudges. She turned, startled. her hand stained with red and blue streaks. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She smirked, as if daring me to react. "Oh, I thought these were old. My bad. My bad." That was her apology. I stormed out, clutching the ruined materials, and confronted Mom and Alan. I laid everything out, the sabotage, the dismissive remarks, the disrespect. But Alan didn't even flinch. Instead, he crossed his arms and said, "You're overreacting, Hannah. You've always been dramatic." Then he called me stupid. Mom just sat there, shaking her head, as if I was the problem. That night, I barely slept. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I called Dad, who arrived within 30 minutes, his truck rumbling into the driveway like a lifeline. Mom tried to stop me as I packed my things. "You're overreacting," she said again. "Why can't you just try to get along?" I turned to her, my voice trembling with frustration and hurt. "Your husband called me stupid, and you said nothing. Your stepdaughter destroyed my work, and you did nothing. That's not overreacting. It's self-preservation." Dad didn't say much, but I could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. As we loaded the last box into the truck, Alan appeared in the doorway, smug as ever. The tension was unbearable, and when Dad confronted him, security had to step in before things got physical. It was chaos, but in a strange way, I felt a sense of liberation. Moving in with Dad was like breathing fresh air after being underwater for too long. No more walking on eggshells. No more sabotage or judgment. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I focused on rebuilding, working hard, and saving every penny I could. One day, I told myself I'd have a home of my own, a sanctuary no one could take from me. I didn't know then how much more I would have to endure before that dream became a reality. The first few months living with Dad in Greenville were a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. His small apartment wasn't exactly homey, but it was peaceful, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was constantly under attack. There were no ruined clothes, no lectures about my life choices, and no smug glances from Jessica. It wasn't perfect. I missed the house I grew up in, and deep down, I missed the version of my mom who used to have my back. But being away from Margaret, Alan, and Jessica gave me space to breathe. I threw myself into work, often staying late to avoid thinking about everything I had left behind. My dad was supportive in the way he always had been, quiet but steady. He didn't pry too much into what had happened, but when I finally told him about the night I left, his jaw tightened, and I could see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "You deserve better," he said simply, and for the first time in a long while, I believed it. In those first few months, Margaret called me often, sometimes apologetic but mostly defensive. "You need to understand," she'd say, "Alan is just looking out for you. He's old-fashioned, that's all." Or, "Jessica didn't mean to hurt you. She's young and impulsive. You have to give her some grace." I couldn't bring myself to argue anymore. I started letting her calls go to voicemail, the sound of her voice stirring a mix of anger and sadness I didn't want to confront. My focus became saving money. Every dollar counted. I packed lunches instead of eating out, skipped social events that weren't free, and took on extra projects at work. I wanted my own home, a place where I wouldn't have to answer to anyone. Over time, I started to feel hopeful again, imagining what it would be like to have a space that was truly mine. But Margaret's life was moving in the opposite direction. Her calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, it was clear her world revolved around Alan and Jessica. "We went to a wine tasting this weekend," she'd say, or, "Jessica is doing so well in her classes. Alan is so proud of her." I learned to tune it out, but one particular call still stings when I think about it. I had just gotten a small raise at work and decided to share the news with Margaret. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd sound proud. Instead, she sighed and said, "That's nice, Hannah. You should talk to Alan about career advice. He's got great connections. He could help you find something more ambitious." The words cut deep, but I masked my hurt with indifference. "I'm doing fine on my own, Mom," I said, ending the conversation as quickly as possible. Things only got worse during the holidays. I had planned to spend Christmas with Dad, but Margaret insisted I come over for dinner. "It'll just be family," she promised. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When I arrived, the house felt different. Margaret had redecorated, and all the familiar touches of my childhood were gone. In their place were Alan's leather armchair, a huge flat-screen TV, and an array of tacky decorations Jessica must have picked out. Jessica greeted me with her usual syrupy smile. "Hannah, you made it," she said, but the glint in her eyes told me she wasn't thrilled to see me. The dinner itself was a minefield. Alan couldn't resist making his usual jabs, critiquing everything from my outfit to my job. "Still working at that little office, huh? You know, Jessica's professor says she has great potential for corporate work. Maybe you should ask her for tips." Jessica beamed at the mention of her potential, but wasted no time undermining me. "You should really start networking more, Hannah. It's all about who you know." I bit my tongue, shoveling mashed potatoes onto my plate to avoid saying something I'd regret. Margaret, of course, said nothing, her focus on making sure Alan's wine glass stayed full. The final straw came when Jessica started bragging about her plans to spend spring break in Europe. "Daddy's covering most of it," she said, shooting me a smug glance. "But I'm saving up for the extras." I couldn't help myself. "Saving up? Does that mean you got a job?" Her smile faltered, and for a brief moment, the room was silent. Then Alan cut in, his voice dripping with condescension. "Not everyone's as frugal as you, Hannah. Some people actually know how to enjoy life." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Thanks for the dinner, Mom. I think I've had enough family time for one night." Margaret followed me to the door, her face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "Hannah, why do you always have to make things so difficult?" "Me? I'm not the one making things difficult, Mom. You are." I left without waiting for a response, tears stinging my eyes as I drove back to Dad's. After that night, I stopped trying. I stopped answering Margaret's calls, stopped pretending things could ever go back to the way they were. The distance between us grew wider, and I told myself it was for the best. 3 years passed like this. I worked, saved, and finally, I had enough for a down payment on a house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was perfect for me. A small 2-bedroom cottage on the outskirts of Rivertown, with a backyard big enough for a garden. When I signed the papers, I felt a surge of pride I hadn't felt in years. This was mine. Every inch of it was mine, bought with my hard work and sacrifice. I decided to throw a housewarming party to celebrate. I invited my closest friends and, hesitantly, Margaret. I made it clear that Alan and Jessica were not welcome. Margaret agreed without argument, and for a brief moment, I thought things might finally be looking up. But if I'd learned anything over the years, it was that with my mom, nothing was ever that simple. The day of the housewarming party felt like the culmination of years of hard work and perseverance. My little cottage was exactly what I had dreamed of, a cozy 2-bedroom house with a charming garden where I'd already started planting herbs and flowers. The walls were painted in soft, warm tones, and the kitchen, though small, had sleek granite countertops that made me smile every time I walked in. It wasn't just a house, it was my sanctuary. I spent the morning arranging trays of appetizers, setting out drinks, and making sure every corner of my new home was as welcoming as possible. My friends arrived first, their laughter filling the house as they admired the space. It felt surreal to finally share my achievement with the people who had supported me through so much. When Margaret arrived, I braced myself for awkwardness. She was alone, just as we'd agreed. I had been clear in my invitation. Alan and Jessica were not welcome. She gave me a tentative smile as she stepped inside, carrying a bottle of wine and a small potted plant. "This is lovely, Hannah," she said, looking around. "You've done well for yourself." Her approval felt lukewarm, but I tried to focus on the positives. At least she had shown up. The party was in full swing when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I froze, a sense of foreboding washing over me. As I opened the door, my heart sank. There they were, Alan and Jessica, standing smugly on my doorstep. Margaret hovered behind them, avoiding my gaze. "Surprise," she said weakly, her voice almost drowned out by Jessica's excited chatter. I could barely process the audacity of it all. Alan strolled in without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room with a critical air. Jessica followed, her expression a mix of entitlement and disdain. "This is cute," Jessica said, her voice dripping with sarcasm as she ran her hand along the kitchen counter. "A little small, but cozy." Alan let out a low chuckle. "You've done well, Hannah. For someone on your salary, anyway." I clenched my fists, fighting to keep my composure. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice cold. Margaret stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. "I thought it would be nice to bring everyone together. It's a celebration, after all. A celebration for the people I invited." I snapped. "And they weren't invited." Jessica rolled her eyes dramatically. "Relax, Hannah. We're family." Her words sent a jolt of anger through me. Family. The same word Margaret had used to justify every slight, every betrayal. As Jessica wandered off, inspecting the living room with thinly veiled disdain, Alan made himself at home on the couch, his posture oozing arrogance. "The hardwood floors are nice," he said, tapping his shoe against the ground. "But crown molding? A bit dated, don't you think?" "Really?" I shot back, my voice sharp. "Because I don't remember asking for your opinion." Jessica smirked from across the room. "Don't be so sensitive, Hannah. We're just teasing." Something inside me snapped. I turned to Jessica, my voice steady but icy. "That's interesting. What job are you planning to use to buy a house? Or are you still living off Daddy's credit card?" Her face flushed, the smugness wiped away in an instant. "I have prospects," she said, her voice defensive. "Prospects aren't paychecks," I replied, refusing to back down. Alan's face turned red as he took a step toward me, his eyes blazing with anger. For a moment, I thought he might actually yell, but Margaret grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "That's enough. Let's go." She led them toward the door, muttering apologies under her breath. Jessica threw one last glare my way before following them out. As the door closed behind them, I stood there shaking, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and relief. My friends gathered around, their expressions a mix of concern and admiration. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. I nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Let's get back to the party." And we did. I refused to let them ruin my night. Surrounded by my real friends, the ones who had supported me through every struggle, I felt a sense of peace return. This was my home, and for the first time, I truly felt like I belonged here. But the incident lingered in my mind long after the party ended. Margaret's betrayal stung the most. She had agreed to my terms, only to completely disregard them. It wasn't the first time she had chosen Alan and Jessica over me, but this felt different. This was my space, my life, and they had no right to intrude. A week later, I received a note from Margaret. It was long and rambling, filled with excuses about how she had just wanted to mend the family, how I was being too harsh, and how I needed to learn to forgive. Forgive. The word felt like a slap in the face. Where was the forgiveness when Alan and Jessica disrespected me over and over? Where was the understanding when I tried to explain how they made me feel? I didn't respond. Instead, I poured my energy into my home. I planted flowers in the backyard, rearranged furniture, and made every inch of the house a reflection of me. It became my sanctuary, the one place where I could feel safe and in control. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Margaret had crossed a line, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time. I had learned to expect the unexpected with her, Alan, and Jessica. But even then, I couldn't have predicted what they would do next. It had been a few months since the housewarming fiasco, and life had finally started to settle into something resembling normalcy. My house was my refuge. Every plant I nurtured in my garden, every room I meticulously organized, and every small decorative touch reminded me that this was a space I had created for myself. Then my supervisor called me into her office with an unexpected opportunity. "Hannah," she began, "we need someone to lead a major project at our Atlanta branch. It's a great chance for you to showcase your skills and make an impact. The only catch is, it's for 2 weeks." My first reaction was excitement, but that quickly gave way to worry. 2 weeks away from my house. 2 weeks away from the delicate indoor plants I'd cultivated, including my pride and joy, a rare bird of paradise plant that had finally started to bloom. Each one required specific care, and the thought of returning to find them wilted or dead was unbearable. I debated every option. I could ask a friend, but most of them were busy with their own lives and lacked a green thumb. I even considered hiring a professional plant sitter, but I couldn't justify the expense on such short notice. That left one person, Margaret. I agonized over the decision. After everything that had happened, asking her for help felt like inviting trouble. But she loved gardening. Her front yard was a riot of color, her vegetables always the envy of the neighborhood. Maybe this could be a way to mend our strained relationship, I told myself. Just her and me. No Alan. No Jessica. When I arrived at her house, Margaret seemed genuinely surprised to see me. Hannah, is everything okay? She asked, ushering me into the kitchen. I need a favor, I said, explaining the business trip and my concern about leaving the house unattended. Would you be willing to look after my plants? Just water them. Make sure they're doing okay. It's only for 2 weeks. Her face lit up with almost too much enthusiasm. Of course, honey. You know how much I love gardening. I'd be happy to help. I handed her the spare key along with detailed care instructions for each plant. She skimmed the pages briefly before tucking them into her purse. Don't worry about a thing, she said with a smile that seemed overly eager. Just focus on your work. I'll take care of everything. Her enthusiasm unsettled me, but I dismissed it as paranoia. What could go wrong? It was just a few plants. The next morning, as I packed my bags, I caught sight of Margaret's car slowly driving past my street. She didn't stop or wave, just rolled by as if checking something. When I called her later to ask about it, she laughed nervously. Oh, I was just running errands. Nothing to worry about. Still, I felt uneasy. Before leaving for the airport, I double-checked every room, snapping photos of the interior as a precaution. I even installed a small security camera in the living room, though I felt guilty for not trusting my own mother. The first few days of my trip were uneventful. Margaret sent brief updates during our calls, assuring me that everything was fine. The plants are thriving, she said, but something about her tone felt off. No matter what time I called, she always seemed to be at my house, and there were strange noises in the background. Clinking dishes, the hum of a TV, even what sounded like faint laughter. Are you sure everything's okay? I asked during one call. Of course, she replied, her voice cheerful but strained. You're worrying too much. Just focus on your work. When I tried to check the security camera feed, I discovered it was offline. Margaret claimed she had accidentally knocked the cord loose while watering a plant. I couldn't figure out how to plug it back in, she said dismissively. My unease grew with each passing day, but the breaking point came when a coworker sent me a series of screenshots from Jessica's social media accounts. The first photo showed her lounging in my living room, her feet propped up on the coffee table. The caption read, "Netflix and chill in my new space." My heart sank as I scrolled to the next image. Jessica in my kitchen, holding a mug I recognized as my own. "Love my new granite countertops," the caption declared. The timestamps revealed that she had been posting these photos for days. Panic set in. I immediately tried calling Margaret, but my calls went straight to voicemail. I tried Alan next, then Jessica. Blocked. Desperate, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Clarkson, who lived next door and had always been friendly. "Mrs. Clarkson," I said, my voice trembling, "have you noticed anything strange at my house?" She hesitated before responding. "Well, your mother said you were letting your sister stay there while you were gone. I've seen her moving things in over the past week." I could barely hold the phone as my hands shook with rage. "She's not my sister," I said through gritted teeth, "and I didn't give anyone permission to stay there." Mrs. Clarkson gasped. "Oh, Hannah, I'm so sorry. I assumed you knew." I booked the earliest flight home, a red-eye that landed just after midnight. The Uber ride to my house felt like an eternity. When I arrived, the sight of my home sent a fresh wave of anger through me. The drapes had been replaced, and I could see new furniture through the windows, furniture that didn't belong to me. My key didn't work in the lock. I tried again, but it was no use. The locks had been changed. Before I could process what was happening, the door opened, and there stood Jessica, dressed in pajamas and looking thoroughly irritated. "Why are you here?" she asked, as though I were the intruder. "This is my house," I said, my voice trembling with anger. What are you doing here? Living here, she said with a smirk. Daddy helped me move in while you were off playing businesswoman. Get out, I said, my voice rising. This is my home. You don't belong here. She crossed her arms, her smirk deepening. That's not happening. I'm very comfortable here. By the way, the water pressure in the shower is great. I clenched my fists, every nerve in my body screaming for me to push past her and reclaim my space. But before I could act, she slammed the door in my face. I stood there on my own porch, shaking with fury and disbelief. The flower beds I had carefully tended were trampled. My home, the sanctuary I had worked so hard for, had been invaded. And Margaret? She had made it all possible. I stood on my porch, staring at the closed door of what was supposed to be my sanctuary. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone. The rage bubbling inside me was nearly overwhelming, but I refused to let it paralyze me. I dialed Margaret, my fingers pressing the numbers with more force than necessary. She answered on the third ring, her voice groggy as though she'd been asleep. Hannah, what's wrong? What's wrong? I hissed. I just got home to find Jessica living in my house. She says she's been here for weeks. Tell her to get out or I'm calling the police. The sleepy tone in her voice disappeared, replaced by panic. Hannah, please don't do that. We'll come over. Just wait there, okay? I hung up without answering, pacing the porch as I waited. My neighbor's lights flickered on one by one, curious eyes peeking through curtains. I could imagine what they were thinking. Me, pacing outside my own home in the middle of the night, looking like I'd lost my mind. Half an hour later, Margaret's car pulled up, Alan at the wheel. They climbed out in their pajamas, rushing toward me with expressions that looked more annoyed than apologetic. What's going on? Margaret demanded, her voice tight. What's going on? I snapped. Why is Jessica living in my house? Why were the locks changed? And why did you let this happen? Margaret's face turned red as she stammered. She needed a place to stay, Hannah. Her lease ended, and she couldn't afford the rent increase. Your house was just sitting here empty. I felt my jaw drop. Empty? It's my house. It wasn't empty. It was mine. You had no right. Alan stepped forward, puffing out his chest like he was some kind of authority figure. Telling you about it would have been pointless. You would have just said no. Of course I would have said no. I shouted. It's my home. We did you a favor, Alan said dismissively, waving his hand like this was all some minor misunderstanding. The locks needed to be replaced anyway. You replaced the locks on someone else's house without their permission? I asked, my voice dangerously low. That's illegal, you know. Illegal, legal. Who cares? He sneered. It's done now. Besides, this house is too big for one person. Jessica needed it more than you. That was it. I had reached my breaking point. Get her out of my house, I said, my voice steady with barely controlled fury. Get her out right now, or I'm calling the cops. Alan laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You're not going to call the police on your own family. Margaret stepped forward, her hands clasped together as though pleading. Hannah, please. Let's not ruin the family over this. Ruin the family? I repeated, my voice breaking. You mean the family that let your husband and his daughter take over my house? The family that treated me like an afterthought? That family? Margaret's face crumpled, but I didn't care. For years, I had tried to preserve peace, swallowing my pride and biting my tongue. Not anymore. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The police arrived in less than 20 minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the neighborhood. By then, Margaret was sobbing, Alan was fuming, and Jessica had finally come outside, her expression shifting from smug to panicked as the officers approached. Are you the homeowner? One of the officers asked me. Yes, I replied, pulling up the property records on my phone. Here's proof of ownership. I gave my mother a key to water my plants while I was out of town. Instead, they changed the locks and moved someone else into my house. Alan immediately launched into one of his condescending monologues, spinning a story about misunderstandings and family disputes. But the officer wasn't buying it. You admit to changing the locks without her permission? The officer asked, his pen poised over a notepad. Well, yes, Alan said reluctantly. And you admit to moving someone into the property without the owner's consent? Alan faltered, his bravado slipping. Jessica stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Daddy said it was fine, she sobbed. I didn't know it was illegal. The officer's expression didn't soften. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse, he said firmly. Changing locks and occupying someone else's property without permission constitutes illegal entry. Within minutes, Alan and Jessica were being escorted to the patrol car. Margaret clutched my arm, her face wet with tears. Hannah, please, she begged. Don't do this. They'll have criminal records. Is that what you want? I pulled my arm free, looking at her as though seeing a stranger. I wanted my mother to protect me, I said quietly. I wanted to feel safe in my own house. But you chose them over me, over and over again. I'm done. As the officers drove away, I called an emergency locksmith to change the locks yet again. Margaret stayed on the porch, watching in silence. When the locksmith handed me the new keys, she finally spoke. You're no longer my daughter, she said, her voice trembling with rage. I looked at her for a long moment before replying. And you're no longer my mother. You made that choice when you let them take everything from me. She left without another word. The next day, I began the process of reclaiming my home. The plants I had cherished were dead, their leaves brittle and brown from neglect. My kitchen cabinets were filled with Jessica's junk, and my spare bedroom had been turned into her personal closet, littered with designer clothes and empty shopping bags. The house no longer felt like mine, but I was determined to make it so again. I cleaned for hours, scrubbing away every trace of their presence. I bought new plants, installed better security cameras, and changed all the passwords on my accounts. When the police called to ask if I wanted to press charges, I didn't hesitate. Yes, I said firmly. I want to file charges. Months later, Alan and Jessica accepted plea deals to avoid jail time. They were placed on probation and ordered to pay restitution for the damage they caused. Margaret sat with them in court, never once looking my way. I haven't spoken to her since. Life goes on. My garden is blooming again. My house feels like home once more, and I've started dating someone who respects my boundaries. I've learned that some bridges need to be burned to protect yourself. Sometimes, cutting ties isn't just a choice. It's survival.